From Wana Brands, welcome to Enhance Your Life. I'm your host, Jonathan Small, and each week I talk to people from all sorts of professions and backgrounds about how cannabis has enhanced their lives and how this healing plant can enrich your life too. Hey everybody, welcome to the Enhance Your Life podcast. My name is John Small and I am your host, and I am very excited about my guest today. David Bienenstock is in the house, and David has many, many credentials. I will just list them here. He is the author of a book called How to Smoke Pot Properly, a highbrow guide to getting high. Great name. He's also co-creator of a podcast, which I love, called Great Moments in Weed History with Abdullah and Bean. And previously, David served as head of content at High Times, that venerable publication, and was a columnist, a frequent contributor, and a video host and producer at Vice Media, where he co-produced the series Bong Appetit. He's a contributor of Vice and Leafly and GQ and The Guardian. You name it, he's written for them about weed and other topics. And he is going to talk to us today about all of this. I am really curious, David. Welcome, first of all, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
I am a little curious about your origin story. I always love to hear how people first discovered cannabis and then kind of how cannabis became such a part of your professional life. Would you take us through that a little bit?
Sure. My origin story is that lightning struck a grow room just as I was transplanting a plant and we fused. No.
You're a weed man, and then you became weed man. I think we have our next comic.
No, my background is in journalism. My heart is always in journalism. And then around 2002, I got a job at High Times. So really combining my love of journalism and my craft of journalism with my lifelong love of cannabis. That was a very different era in weed history, almost a different universe of weed history, and definitely a different era of High Times history. Just gonna quickly say, don't fuck with those guys anymore. But back when it was an independent publication full of people who loved weed, run by people who loved weed, it was really an amazing opportunity, not just to write about this plant and this culture, but to immerse in it. And the thing that keeps it interesting and really is the through line is that when you write about cannabis, and I'm sure you know this, you're really writing about so many different subjects, whether it's criminal justice, so-called criminal justice, or botany, or medicine, or art, culture. You know, it intersects with every topic that you can imagine, and so it's just been a real honor and a privilege.
Do you remember the first time you encountered weed, smoked weed, or however you consumed it? Probably smoked it back in the day.
Yeah, I was behind a bowling alley on Route 22 in New Jersey where I grew up, and it was...
What part of Jersey?
Where the bowling alley is?
Yeah, no. What part of Jersey did you grow up?
North Jersey, not
Okay.
too far from New York City.
Great. I grew up in Westchester County on the other side of the bridge. But so you discovered, how old were you about?
I was a teenager.
Yeah. And was it just love at first puff, or did it take a little while for you to kind of grow used to it and like it?
Well, I didn't really, like a lot of people, I didn't get high the first time I actually puffed. It was behind the bowling alley when it it all came together, which, what more scenic and beautiful place than behind a bowling alley on Route 22. But yeah, it was actually a very profound experience for me, a very personal experience, something that without delving back into my own life trauma, it was the beginning of a profound healing journey for me. We talk about medical cannabis, as we should, as it relates to a lot of physical ailments. I don't need to tell you or your listeners, but it's always worth saying this is a life-saving medicine that's also incredibly safe to use, particularly when compared to pharmaceutical alternatives. For me, it was a journey of, unwinding some life trauma as a young person. And, I like to say weed isn't the cure for being an asshole, but it's a really good place to start. And for me, it was the beginning of that journey as well. I don't know that I've completely made it across the finish line of not being an asshole, but I'm a lot closer than
You seem pretty pleasant to me, but you also might be incredibly high, so I don't know. So what about journalism? What made you interested in writing and journalism?
I was always interested in writing. I was always writing as a young person, so to fall into that as a career was definitely a matter of one thing led to another, just trying to find ways to develop that skill. I did find some journalism jobs out of college, and when a friend saw a want ad for High Times,
He was like, "You're there." How old were you at that time?
I was in my early 20s. I had kicked around at a couple other jobs and been freelancing as a journalist, and really it was such a huge stroke of luck. I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. I didn't know nearly as much, obviously, about cannabis then as I do now. I was a daily weed smoker. I was living in New York City, but I'd never seen a plant growing. Never mind understanding the finer points of the physiology of the plant or the history of it, which is obviously something now on my podcast with Abdullah Saeed, Great Moments in Weed History, that I'm quite fascinated by. But I was a working journalist. I had a genuine love for the plant and really even a reverence for the plant because it had brought so much healing into my life and other people that I knew. And also I was somebody who was always really very angry about the war on drugs. I had seen firsthand how destructive it can be, how unfair it can be, how disproportionately it targets marginalized people and people of color, people with less money, younger people. And so to be offered an opportunity to, on the one hand, celebrate this plant that I truly love, and on the other hand, try to push back against this incredibly racist and oppressive war on drugs, that was everything I could have been looking for as a young person. And it also just brought me into a culture that is pretty wide open in a lot of places in the legalization era. But back then, I like to tell people when I started at High Times, I used to get into the trunk of people's cars to go look at their grows because they wanted to be protected, and I wanted to be able to say in court, if I ever had to, hey, I have no idea where this is. And now you're much more likely to get a business card from a CEO inviting you to their million-acre mega grow. So
I mean, it must be just totally shocking for you to imagine what life was like in 2002 when you're working at High Times in New York, where pot was definitely illegal. I lived in New York at that time. I remember a girlfriend of mine was caught in some sort of sweep through the Central Park and went to jail for the day just for having a joint in her hand. So it was a very different time. And now, where weed is relatively available in many, many states recreationally, you can't go outside in Los Angeles for 3 feet without smelling it. So does it blow your mind? Did you ever see this time coming?
Yes and no. Let me put it this way. I was recently back in New York for 420 this year, went to Washington Square Park, which is like the sort of old school bohemian city block sized park in Greenwich Village.
That's where you always used to buy weed.
Well, that's where you used to buy, grass clippings or, it was a great place to get beat for weed. It was a great place to get arrested for weed. And, the entire time that I lived in New York City, I got arrested for smoking weed on the street. And obviously it was the stop and frisk era in predominantly neighborhoods that are full of people of color being targeted by the police for just random stops and searches. And now to be in Washington Square Park on 420, at 420, with thousands of New Yorkers lighting up at once, people openly setting up little folding tables to display their wares. I can't tell you, I guess, as a fellow former New Yorker of the Prohibition era, how incredible of a feeling that was. By the time I moved to California, it was long after Prop 215. A lot of these changes that are just happening now in some places, my home state of New Jersey, the stores just opened, California, other places on the West Coast have been far ahead. So I gotta stress the thing that people would say back in the day. You'd say, I'm working on this issue of legalization. I'm part of this social justice movement to change these laws, to stop these arrests. At the time, 700,000 plus arrests a year in the United States alone, the vast majority of them for possession alone, although no one should be arrested. What people would very commonly say is, why are you wasting your time on that? That's never going to happen. And now what people tend to say is, why are you wasting your time on that? It's inevitable. And so the journey from one to the other has been very, very satisfying. You know, the most important thing is stopping these arrests. When I was a young journalist, my beat, so to speak, was not going to fancy weed dinners or the openings of dispensaries. My beat was writing about people who were having their lives torn apart because of using this plant, including using it medicinally. And so I keep that very close to my heart. I keep close to my heart that many people in this country and many, many people around the world, nothing has changed. Unfortunately, people are going to be arrested within the course of this conversation in the United States for the same bullshit. So it's the best of times and in some ways still the worst of times. And the good thing I could tell your listeners is, if you feel like you missed out on this fight, you absolutely have not missed out on this fight. And we do need you.
Yeah, every day. Okay, transitioning here to a little bit of a lighter topic, but still one that's a lot of fun, and that's your podcast, Great Moments in Weed History. It's a great idea for a podcast. I wish I had thought of it first. Damn it. But it really was a great, brilliant idea. How did you guys come up with the idea for it?
Sure. So the podcast was myself and Abdullah Saeed, who most people might know as the host of Bong Appetit on Vice, a show about weed and food. And I was actually the producer of that show. So we were friendly before the show started. We were colleagues and kept in touch. But really, it was working on that show together that brought us together, developed our friendship. I'm not a technical person, so often when the cameras are being moved, when the lights are being moved, Abdul and I would do what we do, which is smoke a joint, talk about the next scene. Often it takes a really long time to get things set, and we tell each other stories and sort of developed our friendship and developed our vibe together. And we came to a point where we both felt that we could not work for Vice anymore. They were much love to my colleagues there and for the work that we did together, but they were a shitty company treating people shittily. I had stopped working with High Times for the same reasons, and we wanted to create something that we could make together, that we could own, and that we could use as a vehicle to talk about cannabis the way we wanted to, and find an audience that was eager for that. We're also both people who love and are fascinated by history, not just the history of cannabis, but history in general. And then the final piece of the puzzle is this history, the outlaw underground resistance history of cannabis is going to be erased if we ourselves within this culture do not preserve it, and we don't celebrate our own heroes and celebrate our own victories and tell our own story, because the corporate wing of cannabis that is coming in, they didn't do shit to legalize this plant. They didn't do anything to stop these arrests. They're coming in to take market share. They're coming in to make money. And so they have every incentive to erase the past because their role in it was not virtuous. I cannot stress that enough. On an individual level, any human person who wants to be a part of the cannabis movement or the cannabis industry and that comes to it with good intentions and an open heart and a willingness to learn and interact and be mutually supportive, the door is wide open. But the idea that legalization happened because it would be a good way for corporations to make money, no. They didn't do anything until we, as a grassroots culture of civil disobedience and political activism, changed these laws. People like Brownie Mary, people like Dennis Perot, people all over this country who fought and suffered for this That's what made the change. Social change in this country and anywhere else comes from the bottom up. And so as we saw the legalization era unfolding and we saw this history that was already suppressed, you know, so many of the stories that we talk about on the podcast are almost written out of history. You know, we tell stories about, like, for instance, Maya Angelou's entire life changed the first time she smoked weed. It was a profound experience that changed the course of this American icon's life. And we got emails and letters from people who said, she's my favorite author. I absolutely love weed, and I never heard this. And so, you know,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, not just when in talking about our own culture heroes, but the real history of cannabis and the world is untold and obscured. And so we work week by week to try to bring these stories back to light, to share them with this culture, and to use them as an example to look at what's happening now and hopefully inspire people. It's certainly inspiring to me to learn about what people have done in the past to bring us to this very exciting moment.
Well, you've done this show now for a number of years, so there's a lot of stories you tell. What are some of the episodes that surprised even you as a historian, you know, as somebody who really knows a lot about the history of weed? What is there any stories that kind of surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of my favorite stories and one of my sort of entry points for people is there was a huge weed subculture among jazz musicians of the 1920s and 30s. You know, I think a lot of people maybe know,
the Mez. Yeah, they know the Mez area. Yeah, but that's before.
Louis Armstrong smoked weed and et cetera, but the depth of it, you know, we have this misconception that cannabis culture in the United States dates back to the hippies in the 1960s, and that is its own form of erasure of jazz culture and earlier cultures. And also on the show, we will go back thousands of years. We have an episode called Napoleon Invaded Egypt, and that's how hashish got to Europe, going back to the late 1700s. We have an episode about the evidence that exists that Jesus used cannabis to perform healing miracles. That's a show I was pretty skeptical about until we started to dig into the evidence. And, you know, I would just say to anybody, check out that episode of our show and go on that journey. And
did you get some pushback from that episode?
We got a few angry emails, and particularly I did a thing for Now This, so that was summarizing the evidence and got some pushback. That doesn't bother me. Much more was people who said, wow, this changes my perspective on a religion that I either believe in or that was forced upon me as a young person, or simply this is something that I was never exposed to. So you got to kind of take angry people as a sign that you're reaching people. You know, there's a lot of angry people out there. So if nobody's angry with you, you're probably talking to yourself.
Yeah. I was surprised. So I was looking back at some of your episodes. You'd mentioned Maya Angelou. Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, smoked pot.
Well, she probably ate it, which was a common way. She wrote a bunch of short stories under pseudonyms during her life, even after becoming very successful, because there were a lot of subjects that were hard to address at the time. But she wrote a short story called Perilous Play. You can find it online, about a group of young socialites, one of whom seems to be a stand-in for her, who spend an afternoon getting pretty fucked up on hashish bonbons, which were commercially available. You know, the other important thing when we talk about this history is federal prohibition only goes back to 1937. Prior to that, not only did we have cannabis widely available as medicinal tinctures, but there were companies selling hashish bonbons, advertising them. You can find old ads in magazines, and yeah, you know, hashish is no different then than now. And of course, the history of hashish, particularly going back to places like Morocco and India and other traditional cultures of origin for hashish, It goes back thousands of years. It's older than wine culture. But yeah, it's a pretty funny story. It's a love story. Weed plays a very positive role in bringing these two young people together. They go out on a rowboat. They make the classic mistake of, and I think any modern person can understand this, they eat too much edibles, but before they take hold, these two young lovers go out in a rowboat, and then all of a sudden a storm kicks up, the hashish kicks in, and high jinks ensue.
Wow. What is one of your most popular episodes? I'm sure you look at your numbers. Is there an episode that just kind of really knocked it out of the park? I'm curious.
People seem to love Willie Nelson smoked a joint on the roof of the White House. I think there's probably no living American who is more beloved in this country than Willie Nelson. You know, he cuts across so many of our cultural divides.
Willie Nelson for president, right? I mean, my God, he could probably unite the country.
And so, you know, back in, I don't want to give too much of the story away, but dude smoked a joint on the roof of the White House.
Unbelievable.
How many people can say that? Only 2 people that we know about. So, you know, that's a very fun story. I also just stress, you know, we picked great moments in weed history on purpose. Part of it is my experience of having written about people getting fucked with for so long. There's obviously an important place for that. But for a show that is also going to be about history and celebration of this plant, many of our stories are about people who overcame adversity. It's not great moments as in nothing bad happens. It's great moments as in take this journey with us, and in the end, weed is going to win.
Yeah, be inspired. It's a great idea. I can't let you go without understanding a little bit more about how to smoke pot properly, your book. So tell me the origin of that book, because you know, it's an interesting approach, a highbrow guide to getting high. How does one get high in a highbrow way?
Oh, I mean, that's a little.
I know it's a play on words.
I'm kind of a highbrow, lowbrow guy, you know, and there's really, of course, as long as you have the unlit end of the joint in your mouth, you're definitely doing fine. It's more about how do you participate in this culture properly? How do you, on the one hand, I love the name of this podcast, Enhance Your Life, because that's something that cannabis has done for me profoundly. And I think to smoke pot properly is, on the one hand, how do I get the most out of this? Medicinally, spiritually, for fun, to enhance everything from cooking a meal to taking a walk in the woods, and then looking outward using lessons that I learned from people that I wrote about, who inspired me or taught me about this culture. How can you be a good participant in this culture? How can you help, on the one hand, fight for the rights that we still lack in so many places? And how can you make sure that cannabis stays inclusive and kind and anti-establishment in a way? As we move into this legalization era, it's important that we don't forget what we've been through. And it's important that we don't embrace the same authorities who put us in cages for possession or distributing a medicinal plant. Like, it's easy to lose sight sometimes of how profoundly fucked up that is, and how profoundly flawed the authorities who would not only do this but do it for 100 years are. And so you can't simply say, okay, well, now I live in California and weed is legal, so I guess everything's okay. It ain't. You know, right. And so many of the problems that we see in our society are reflected in this war on drugs and this war on weed. It's just very easy to see them when it's about something that you care about and when it's about something that is so obviously good. Weed is one of the best things there is. It's not that it's not bad, as they say. It's that it's actually good, and they still used it as a tool of oppression. And so, you know, for me, to smoke pot properly is to want to get all the benefits of it, and also to never turn your back on the oppression that has been forced upon us by these illegitimate authorities.
Well said. Well said. David Bienenstock, thank you so much for taking the time. The podcast is called Great Moments in Weed History. I highly recommend it. The book is great, How to Smoke Pot Properly. And David, if people want to follow you, are you kind of out there on social media at all?
Yeah, you can find me on social media. You can find the podcast at GMIWH Podcast. We're pretty shadow banned, but just keep typing in Great Moments in Weed History.
I found you. You're on like FM player or something. You're there. You're on iTunes.
Wherever we get podcasts. And I would just say to people, we have more than 60 episodes. So, about politicians, musicians, artists, activists, scroll through the podcast feed and you're going to find a story about somebody that you're already interested in, and dive in and take this journey with us, please.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and you get a lot smarter as a result of listening to your podcast. All right, David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Absolutely my pleasure.
Enhance Your Life is brought to you by Wana, the #1 infused product in North America. Wana's entire process is designed to deliver the same great experience time after time. They have spent years fine-tuning their recipes so that their products are delicious, consistent, and potent. For more information, head on over to wanabrands.com. That's Wana, W-A-N-A, brands.com.